Okay, our first presenter is Dr. Liz Ahern. Dr. Ahern is a medical oncologist at Monash Health, and Dr. Ahern will go through an insider's guide to clinical trials.
Thanks so much, Marina, and thank you to the organisers for asking me today. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I too would like to extend my respect to elders past and present and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today. My name is Liz. Just a bit about me. So I'm a medical oncologist. I'm a relatively junior medical oncologist, and I graduated with my letters a couple of years ago in 2019. And during that time, I also got a PhD up in Queensland in tumour immunology. So that's my real interest. In terms of what I do now, I work half-time at Monash Health as an oncologist and half-time as a researcher at Monash Uni. And in terms of my clinical work, I do lots of clinical trials. So that's neuro-oncology trials, but also some other ones like lung cancer and phase 1. And so really my main aim today was to try to sort of help for you to demystify, I guess, some of the procedures, processes, and even just language surrounding clinical trials, because I know this is a fairly daunting area, and it's one that we're all very, very interested, but I think that it can be a lot, you know. Following me this morning, you're going to be hearing from two real superstars, I think, of different parts of the brain research field in Australia. So we'll have Jim Whittle. Sorry, I'm trying to work my screen. Yep. Jim Whittle, who will be talking a little bit about clinical research, and then Associate Professor Misty Jenkins, who will be talking about some of her preclinical research, which is aiming for clinical research. What I wanted to do as a sort of like a lead into their presentations was to give some information about how clinical trials work just in general terms. So as I've sort of alluded to there's a few different types of research when we talk about cancer research. There's preclinical research, which really sort of relates to things that are done in the lab before making it into the clinic. So that's like setting the groundwork for a clinical trial and making the discoveries that we think look exciting enough to go forward into a clinical trial. And then in terms of clinical research or research with patients, the one that I'm really going to focus on is clinical trials, which are when we really assess the safety and how good a new treatment might be for a particular disease. And so a treatment is usually a drug, a new drug, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a drug. It can be a supportive care intervention, or sometimes, for example, something to do with sequencing or types of radiotherapy, for example. But mainly today, I'm going to sort of talk about the drug clinical trial research, but just know that it can be a bit more broad than that. So for us as doctors, we can be involved at many different parts of the pharmacology and pharmaceutical drug development process. And as you can see in this little schema here, I don't want you to try to read it exhaustively, but just to understand that getting a new treatment or a new drug from the lab into the clinic, and this is an American sort of schema here as well, can actually take many, many years, heaps of money, and many, many patient volunteers and also scientists and clinicians to get there. And there's this estimation that there can be many thousands of potential discoveries in the lab and potential compounds that need to be tested to really sort of focus down into one drug that might work and might end up going into the clinic. And overall, the drug development cost is really massive for that. Unfortunately, in oncology, we do have one of the lowest rates of drugs making it through from the beginning of the clinical trial process into widespread clinical usage, which is unfortunate. And I think it's particularly difficult in brain cancer as well because of some of the aspects of brain cancer therapy, such as the blood-brain barrier, which has really made it difficult for drugs to show benefit in these diseases. So brain cancer is a particularly tough nut to crack. Then in Australia, we've got the additional processes, that I guess bureaucratic processes as well, of a drug coming, say it's been used and it's been licensed overseas. Then we've got to go through the process here, obviously, of getting it approved by the Therapeutic Drugs Authority, and then hopefully to get listed on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, which is when the government decides that the drug is safe and effective and cost effective, and they will subsidise some of the cost of that drug to make it more usable for us, I guess, in a financial sense. So I guess overall it's a really long process, and one that's got lots and lots of pitfalls in it. So what I'm going to sort of run through today quickly is topics of understanding different types of clinical trial designs and some terminology and the types of treatments that you might be offered in a clinical trial. How do you find a clinical trial? Questions about deciding to take part in a clinical trial, which can be a complicated and very personal process, I think. How to join a study and what happens when you join a study. And then what happens if you do get onto a study during the study and at the end of the study as well. So just starting off by talking very briefly about some concepts in clinical trial design. This is a pretty busy slide, and I got this from a great resource at Cancer Australia called Understanding Clinical Trials and Research, which you can Google, and I really recommend, if you're interested, to have a little look at it online, this booklet that they've published. For us in the clinics, we may be involved in all different phases of clinical trials, from phase 1 through to phase 4. And these trials have got various cohort sizes. So for example, in phase 1 trials that I do, very few patients, maybe numbered in the tens, all the way through to the later phase clinical trials where we might have hundreds or thousands of patients. We also increasingly have this concept of phase 0 clinical trials, and actually Dr. Whittle, who's going to talk to us next, is really an expert and very interested in this sort of trial as well. And this one I think is particularly interesting for brain cancer because it's really a trial which is designed to assess whether or not a drug really makes it to where we want it to go. And I think that that's a major topic in brain cancer research. But why, for you as the patient, why is it important to have some kind of understanding about these phases of clinical trials? I guess there's these features of the different phases of clinical trials which would really affect the sorts of treatments that you would get offered in the clinical trial. So as you get more later through the phases, from phase 1 towards phase 3, what it means is that the drug has been more and more studied in people. And so a drug, for example, that's in phase 1, this would be the first time humans have had this drug. And so we're just trying to check that it's safe. And we're hoping to see that it shows some effect on the tumour as well. By the time it gets to phase 3 and phase 4, this is actually looking like a drug that is that is potentially effective. And so we're trying to check it against what we already have as being the best other alternative option at the moment. But there's these other features as well with clinical trials designs, which I'll just go through now, which also affects the sort of treatments that you'll get. So this is to do with whether or not you're on an open label or blinded study, or if you're on a randomized study or not. So what does that mean? So if you're on an open label study, and that's often one of the very early phases, the study team and you as the participant know what you're getting. So we actually know that you're on the active drug and everybody is aware of that. Whereas if you're in a later phase trial and it's blinded, that means that sometimes the study team and also yourself don't actually know what intervention arm you're in the trial, which is to say, we're not absolutely sure what treatment you're getting. Also, some trials can be randomized. And what this means is that the trial groups are randomly allocated. So if you're offered a randomized clinical trial, that usually means that something like a computer code is used to randomly allocate you into one of two arms or one of many arms. And so that really means that your trial team that you're going to virtually always really has no influence over what type of treatment you're going to be getting in the trial because it's totally randomized. What sort of treatments might you get offered in a clinical trial? So you might get the active intervention. So that's actually the drug that's being studied. So that's good. So you might be definitely allocated to the drug that's being studied. Sometimes there can be a control arm, which is for comparison, and that could typically be the standard care. So you might be in a clinical trial, but actually be allocated to the currently known best treatment as you might get otherwise off the trial. And then there's a third type of treatment, which I think it's really important to understand, which is placebo. So some trials can also be randomized with a placebo arm. And this is typically to be used in a situation where we're not sure if any drug works. And so a placebo is sometimes called a sugar pill. It's really a non-active treatment, which is just there to help us avoid any biases and to understand if the people who are getting the active drug are genuinely benefiting and there's no bias in the study. One theme, I think, in terms of types of treatments in a clinical trial that I sometimes see is thinking about access to the investigational product after the trial ends. And so that's a tip from me to all patients out there who are thinking of going onto a clinical trial, is just to have a little think about looking into the patient information or asking the investigator about if the drug or the intervention is helping you, what is the arrangement for continuing to access that even after the clinical trial might end. Who writes the clinical trial? So that can be lots of different groups. So it can be individual investigators like me or Jim or Misty that you're hearing from this morning. It can be collaborative groups like COGNO, or it can be universities. Many times it's actually industry, such as pharma or biotech companies. And the trials can be funded by grants through national research organisations like the NHMRC, or charities or fundraisers, hospitals, and also industry trials are often funded by private funding as well, so by the pharma companies themselves. But all of these clinical trials, no matter who has written them and who is funding them, you should know that they, by the time they get into our hospitals and into our clinics, they have been reviewed by an ethics committee and a governance committee to make sure that they are ethically, logistically and scientific sound. And that's in relation to certain best practice standards, such as good clinical practice and the NHMRC guidelines. They're also registered with the TGA for the Australian government, and that sort of covers all different aspects of ethics of the trials, such as privacy for you as the participant and also data security. So moving on quickly, how do you find a clinical trial? So there's lots of different ways. I recommend just starting off by talking to your specialist in the first instance. You can also always ask for a second or third opinion from other people in the field, for example, at the same hospital or other hospitals. Peer support, such as the BTAA, would be a good way of linking up and hearing about trials that are coming out. Clinical trials websites, such as some of those that I'm showing on the screen here, such as Cancer Council, ClinTrial Refer, Australian Cancer Trials and COGNO. All of these websites would be good places to go to have a look for trials that might be relevant for you. Always ask your specialist if they think that this is something that could be right for you, and if they would consider referring you for that. My special tip here is that you don't have to join a study at your own treatment centre. So your doctor is allowed to refer you to a trial somewhere else, at another hospital, for example. Deciding to take part in a clinical trial, I think, is really individual. It's very nuanced. And there's lots of things that you need to think about, pros and cons when you're doing that. And I just wanted to put up a few ideas in that respect here. So I wanted to start off by thinking in terms of benefits and risks. So in terms of benefits, when I think about offering a trial to patients, I think, if this is actually a treatment that's going to work, then my patients who go onto the trial are going to be amongst the first in the world to actually benefit from this new treatment. So that's really exciting. Sometimes a trial can help you access expensive drugs as well too, which aren't yet listed on the PBS, so which is to say they aren't yet affordable to the vast majority of patients. Also, I think many patients tell me that they feel good about being in clinical trials as well, because they know that they're participating in research which might help other people in the future. However, it's not a guarantee that it's going to help you, which is important to know. So just like standard treatments that we have already in the clinic, even if this new treatment works for other people, it may not work for you, unfortunately. And sometimes these trials are also trying to figure out why that might be. Also, this new intervention might actually not be better than what we already have. And so that's a risk that we have to take. And also, obviously, side effects can occur as well. And that's the case with really anything we do in terms of drugs and treatment and that sort of thing. It's important to think about your care team, so who will be caring for you during the trial. And for day-to-day issues, that's generally the investigator team, the people who are running the trial, and you would normally have a clinical trial coordinator that you can contact for day-to-day questions. It's important to know if you can still see your usual doctor, and that's usually the case. You can still usually see your own usual doctor if you want to as well. And then in terms of commitments, I think it's really important just to think about that as well. So what will be required of you and for how long? Are there any additional procedures that are required? So sometimes, this is less so in brain cancer, but sometimes they will ask you to donate a tissue biopsy, for example. Are there special scans or other tests? If that's the case, typically they should be covered, so you shouldn't have to be out of pocket for any of those sorts of things. How often will you actually need to travel up to the hospital or clinic to be seen? And I know that during COVID, that's a major issue for some people. And will any of the out-of-pocket expenses be reimbursed for those sorts of visits, such as car parking? So deciding to take part in a clinical study really revolves around weighing up all those benefits and risks and all of those considerations. And it's really an individual thing. Everybody's different and has a different take on it. So I got these quotes off a patient discussion board, really, and it shows all different voices of patients when thinking about clinical trials. Some people say I'm very willing to be in it. Some say I'm turned off by some of the logistics and things that they had to do. Will participating in the trial be much more inconvenient? And what are the advantages which outweigh that? This requires a lot of thought. But then some other people say it was worthwhile going onto the trial because I was able to access the treatment, and I also felt that I was contributing to the research as well. So there's a sort of idea about all different flavors of what people think about it. If you do find a study and you think you'd like to consider joining it, this is typically what will happen. So you'll go through an informed consent process. This means that you'll be given some patient information about the study. This should be written, and you should have a reasonable amount of time to look at that yourself and also discuss it with others. And you're allowed to discuss these patient information forms with whoever you want to and whoever you need to that would help you make a decision. And that can include your partner, family or friends, even your GP or your own specialist that you're seeing at the moment are really good support people to discuss it with. If you do agree to try to join the clinical trial, you will get a written agreement in writing relating to that as well. And then the investigator team will have to check to make sure that you're eligible for the trial as well. And so we have something called eligibility criteria. Unfortunately, these are pretty strict and specific and can often mean that you've got to jump through a lot of hoops, I guess, to get onto the study in terms of things like doing scans and blood tests. There's usually a whole list of inclusion criteria and you've got to meet every single one of those. And then there's another list of exclusion criteria and you're not allowed to have any of those. So exclusion criteria for brain cancer trials might include that you've got other medical problems which might make this trial unsafe for you, or sometimes they'll say you have to have a minimum amount of steroids that you're taking every day, for example. What happens during the study? So the study's run by this protocol, which is really fairly strict and it's prescriptive, and it tells us every step along the way what treatment you should be getting, how we should manage side effects, and when we should be assessing your disease, say with an MRI scan to see how it's going. It's really important to keep up the communication with your study team and also your usual team as well too. And so the trial investigation team should really be taking care of that. It's really important that everybody understands that withdrawing from a clinical trial is allowed at any time for any reason or even no reason. And that's fine. Nobody's going to be upset with you and you don't get a penalty for that. And it doesn't limit your future care either. So you are allowed to withdraw from a clinical trial at any time if you don't feel like it's working well for you. After the trial ends, you usually return to your usual treatment with your usual doctors, but the investigating team might stay in touch with you to hear how you're going. So just my final slides is that I just wanted to talk about, I guess, some controversies and some difficult areas that I as a clinician sometimes see from my patients. So we're obviously living in a global world and everybody's got the internet these days. And so people sometimes talk about joining a clinical trial elsewhere, such as interstate and also overseas. And I think we can perhaps talk about this in the discussion, but this is a really complicated question and it's to do with things like how hopeful is the treatment being studied, and on the other hand, what is really the burden in terms of the massive expense, you know, of going overseas for a study. Accessing clinical trials as well can be really tricky depending on factors such as living regionally, rurally or remotely, unfortunately. And Jim, I think, is going to talk next about access to genomic testing. So that's another issue that we can perhaps talk about in the discussion. And unfortunately, all these things lead to the fact that traditionally there has been inequities in clinical trial participation, which is really disappointing. And so this can be on the basis of things like race or gender or locality, you know, for rural or regional people as well too. I just wanted to finish off by saying where can you get support or find more information about any of these issues that I've spoken about today? So there are some useful websites there, both Australian and international. Obviously, some local support groups for you would include the Brain Tumour Alliance of Australia and the Cancer Council as well. So thanks so much for your attention. I hope that this was in some way useful or informative. I know that was a lot of information going really quickly, but hopefully it's helped set the scene for our superstar speakers to come this morning. So thank you.